In a suburban neighborhood where neatly trimmed hedges and freshly painted fences defined the sense of order, there existed a quiet expectation among residents. Property lines were respected, lawns were maintained, and peace was preserved. But, like many communities bound by the rigid oversight of a homeowners association, beneath the surface of polite smiles lay hidden rivalries, unspoken grudges, and neighbors waiting for a reason to turn civility into hostility. The trigger came in the form of a property line, an invisible boundary that should have been insignificant, yet soon proved to be the fault line for an all-out neighborhood war. At the center of the dispute was a woman who had, over time, earned herself the nickname of the neighborhood Karen. Her real name was Linda, but no one called her that anymore. She was a self-appointed guardian of rules, a relentless enforcer of HOA policies, and a woman who thrived on confrontation. She had lived in the neighborhood for just under 5 years, but in that short span, she had managed to file over a dozen complaints against her neighbors, ranging from trash bins left out for too long to children chalking on sidewalks. It was only a matter of time before her focus turned toward the one thing that could spiral completely out of control: property boundaries. Her next-door neighbor, Mark, had lived in the neighborhood much longer. A man who valued privacy and solitude, he preferred to avoid HOA politics and kept his home in excellent shape, content to stay out of conflicts. But, as fate would have it, the roots of a large oak tree planted near the edge of his backyard had grown just close enough to the boundary to cause trouble. The tree, majestic and decades old, spread its roots wide and its branches further, casting shade not only over Mark's property but also over Linda's yard. The branches dropped leaves onto her lawn. The roots lifted a small section of her walkway. And in Linda's mind, this was nothing short of a personal assault. Rather than a polite conversation, she marched straight into confrontation mode. She measured the distance between the tree trunk and the invisible property line herself, pacing and muttering as though she were a surveyor. She then called the HOA board, lodging a formal complaint that Mark's tree was trespassing and that it violated landscaping rules by interfering with her property's upkeep. The board, overwhelmed with smaller disputes and hesitant to escalate, told her that such issues fell into the category of neighbor-to-neighbor conflicts and advised her to handle it privately. But Linda was not one to let things go. Soon after, she began making small, calculated moves. She stacked bags of leaves she claimed had fallen from Mark's tree right at the edge of the boundary, hoping he would notice and feel guilty. She sprinkled weed killer suspiciously close to the roots, hoping to kill off the offending sections. She even hired her own landscaper to measure what she insisted was an encroachment. Mark, however, remained quiet, choosing not to respond. His silence was not weakness but patience, though in Linda's mind it only emboldened her sense of righteousness. The breaking point came when Linda, after weeks of pacing, filing complaints, and ranting at HOA meetings, decided to build a fence. Not just any fence, but a towering wooden structure that stretched along the property line, dwarfing the quaint picket fences of the neighborhood. It was tall, heavy, and intentionally designed to block the view of Mark's yard while cutting off light and airflow. She called it privacy, but everyone else saw it for what it was: a spite fence. When the fence posts went up, neighbors whispered. Some snickered at the absurdity, while others rolled their eyes at the predictability of it all. But Linda stood proud, arms folded, convinced she had drawn her line, both literally and figuratively. Mark, however, had reached his limit. He had ignored the complaints, overlooked the pettiness, and tolerated the harassment for long enough. But the fence changed everything. It wasn't just wood hammered into the ground, it was a declaration of war. And unlike Linda, Mark wasn't fueled by noise and attention. He was fueled by quiet determination, resourcefulness, and the kind of patience that made his counterattack far more devastating. As the days passed and neighbors continued to whisper, Mark began planning. What started as a property line dispute had now grown into something much bigger, an epic battle of wills, one that would soon turn the quiet suburban neighborhood into a theater of petty revenge, escalating step by step until it spiraled into chaos. The first shots had been fired, and the neighborhood had no idea just how ugly things were about to get. The towering fence stood like a scar across the neighborhood, a wall that blocked out sunlight, disrupted airflow, and cast an imposing shadow over Mark's backyard. For Linda, it was a victory. She paraded around her lawn as though she had won a decisive battle, watering her flowers deliberately near the fence's edge, making sure Mark could hear the hiss of the hose. To her, the message was clear. She had reclaimed her property, and he had been silenced. But while Linda basked in her petty triumph, Mark began his quiet preparations. Unlike her, he did not rant at meetings or pace in his driveway, nor did he loudly declare his intentions. He moved with patience and precision, studying not just the fence but also the rules of the HOA, the city's property codes, and the boundaries themselves. Where Linda saw the fence as her final weapon, Mark saw it as her greatest weakness. What Linda hadn't considered was that her massive wall violated multiple local ordinances. Height restrictions existed for a reason, and her fence surpassed them by a wide margin. She had not sought approval from the HOA before beginning construction, assuming her influence and constant presence at board meetings would shield her from consequences. But Mark quietly gathered the evidence, photographs, measurements, and even a copy of the city OS ordinance, and filed a formal complaint with both the HOA and city code enforcement. Weeks later, when Linda received her first notice of violation, her confidence began to crack. She stormed into the next HOA meeting with a stack of papers, shouting about how she had every right to protect her property. But the board, tired of her theatrics, reminded her that rules applied to everyone, even her. Mark, sitting quietly at the back of the room, didn't utter a single word. His silence was louder than anything Linda could say. Still, Linda was not the kind of person to admit defeat. Instead of tearing down the fence as ordered, she doubled down, filing appeals and sending long-winded emails to the HOA board, claiming she was being targeted. Neighbors rolled their eyes, but Mark remained patient. He knew her stubbornness would only buy him more time, and time was all he needed. Mark's next move was subtle but devastating. If Linda's goal was to wall him in, his counterattack was to make her wall unbearable. He began installing tall trellises just inside his side of the property line, setting up rows of climbing vines that would soon crawl upward and spill over the fence. At first, they were small, delicate plants, barely noticeable. But within weeks, their growth accelerated, sending tendrils curling across the wood, wrapping the fence like nature reclaiming a forgotten ruin. The once proud fence, which Linda had displayed as a monument to her victory, was slowly transformed into a living wall, green, tangled, and wild. The vines released pollen that drifted into Linda's yard, clinging to her patio furniture and aggravating her allergies. Their roots spread, intertwining with her flower beds, choking out her carefully arranged garden. The fence that was supposed to be her shield became a magnet for insects, drawing bees, ants, and spiders that soon migrated toward her porch. Linda complained, of course, filing new grievances with the HOA about unauthorized vegetation, but this time the board dismissed her outright. Mark's trellises were entirely on his property, within regulation, and meticulously documented. He had played by the rules, while she had ignored them. Every argument she raised only reminded the board of her own violations, turning her once-feared influence into little more than background noise. As the weeks turned into months, the situation escalated further. Linda, furious that her spite fence had been turned against her, tried spraying weed killer over the top, hoping to kill the vines. But Mark anticipated this. He installed a drip irrigation system that kept the plants thriving, no matter what she did. Every time she attempted sabotage, the plants seemed to grow back stronger, thicker, and more invasive. The fence began to warp under the pressure of the relentless greenery, its wood bowing and cracking, its once sharp edges hidden beneath a mass of tangled leaves. The neighborhood watched in fascination as the war unfolded. Some neighbors quietly rooted for Mark, admiring his clever, rule-abiding strategies. Others whispered about Linda's meltdown, shaking their heads as they watched her rage against the very fence she had built. What had started as a property line dispute had now become a spectacle, an ongoing drama that residents discussed at block parties, over morning walks, and on community message boards. But beneath the entertainment, a darker reality was forming. Linda, humiliated and outmaneuvered, was growing desperate. Her rants became louder, her accusations more unhinged. She accused Mark of harassment, of poisoning her plants, of turning the neighborhood against her. The more she lashed out, the more isolated she became. Even those who once tolerated her began to keep their distance, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire. Mark, however, remained as calm as ever. He never raised his voice, never engaged in public disputes, never gave Linda the satisfaction of a reaction. He simply continued to cultivate his living wall, letting time and nature do the work for him. To the neighborhood, he became a quiet hero, a man who had found a way to beat the Karen at her own game without ever stooping to her level. But Linda was not done fighting. For her, the war was not about property lines anymore. It was about pride. And pride, once wounded, can drive a person to reckless extremes. The stage was set for the next escalation, one that would push both neighbors to new limits and drag the entire community deeper into their feud. The fence, once a monument to Linda's dominance, was now her greatest humiliation. Where she had imagined privacy and power, she now saw only vines, cracks, and creeping insects. Neighbors who once avoided her now smirked when they passed her yard, whispering to each other about how the woman who loved rules had been beaten by them. For Linda, this wasn't just about the fence anymore. It was about her pride, her reputation, and her control slipping through her fingers. When cornered, people like Linda rarely retreat. They escalate. Her first step was retaliation disguised as maintenance. Early one Saturday morning, before most of the neighborhood was awake, she hired a crew to trim every single branch of Mark S. oak tree that hung near her property line. She told them she had every right to cut back anything that crossed onto her yard. The workers, unfamiliar with the neighborhood drama, did as she asked, sawing away at branches that had provided shade for decades. By the time Mark stepped outside, nearly half the tree's canopy was gone, leaving the majestic oak lopsided and scarred. The neighborhood gasped at the sight. Some residents even filmed the scene from their porches, whispering about how far Linda was willing to go. But Mark didn't shout. He didn't confront her. Instead, he quietly documented the damage, taking photos from every angle. Later that week, Linda received another notice, this time from City Forestry Services. The oak tree was protected due to its age, and her reckless trimming was deemed unauthorized destruction. She was fined heavily, and the HOA piled on with its own citation for failing to seek approval before altering shared landscaping boundaries. The fines stung, but what stung more was the shift in the neighborhood's mood. People stopped pretending to be polite. No one waved back when she passed. Conversations died down when she approached. Even her closest ally on the HOA board began distancing himself, tired of being dragged into her battles. Yet instead of realizing her behavior was the cause, Linda convinced herself it was all part of a conspiracy led by Mark. In her mind, the only solution was to outdo him, to hit back so hard that he would finally cave. And so, she devised her boldest plan yet, an extension of her spite fence. This time, she went beyond the simple wall. She began constructing what could only be described as a barricade. Taller posts, jagged edges, even decorative spikes along the top. She added garish floodlights facing directly into Mark's backyard, timed to flicker on at dusk and bathe his home in harsh white light. She painted the new panels a bright, offensive shade of neon orange, claiming it was modern, but clearly intending to provoke. The neighborhood was horrified. The once idyllic row of houses now had an eyesore that looked more like a construction site than a home. The HOA's phones lit up with complaints, but Linda, confident in her defiance, ignored every warning. She even taunted Mark by working on the additions late into the night, hammering loudly as though each strike were a message. Mark, however, remained calm. He did not argue, he did not threaten, and he did not show anger. Instead, he quietly built his case. He collected witness statements from neighbors, video footage of the floodlights, and detailed notes of every violation. He became methodical, stacking evidence like bricks, waiting for the moment when Linda's recklessness would collapse under its own weight. But while Mark planned carefully, Linda's spiral deepened. Her obsession with the fence consumed her days. She stopped tending to her yard, letting weeds overtake the lawn as she poured all her energy into fortifying her barrier. Packages piled up on her porch, ignored. Trash bins sat at the curb for days, violating the very rules she once enforced so ruthlessly. Her house, once spotless, now reflected the chaos of her war. The neighbors watched with a mix of fascination and unease. What had started as a petty property dispute was now turning into something darker. The fence was no longer just wood and nails. It was a symbol of a woman unraveling, of a feud that was dragging the entire community into its orbit. And yet, in the midst of Linda's reckless frenzy, Mark prepared his next move. Unlike her, he understood that true revenge didn't come from noise or spectacle. It came from precision. He had been patient long enough, but the time was nearing when he would strike decisively. What Linda failed to realize was that every board she nailed, every light she installed, and every inch of neon paint only made her case weaker. She thought she was building a fortress. In reality, she was digging her own grave. The neighborhood could feel the tension building, like a storm waiting to break. No one knew exactly when it would happen, but everyone sensed the war between Mark and Linda was about to explode into its most dramatic chapter yet. The neighborhood had grown used to the sight of Linda's barricade, though used to did not mean accepting it. Every evening, as the floodlights blasted into Mark's yard and reflected harshly off the neon paint, residents muttered about how far things had gone. The once pristine community, with its manicured lawns and picture-perfect curb appeal, now bore the mark of one person's obsession. But what looked like chaos to everyone else was, to Mark, an opportunity. While Linda hammered away at her barricade, convinced she was untouchable, Mark had been quietly putting his plan into motion. For months, he had been documenting everything: photos of the fence's height, videos of the floodlights spilling into his home, screenshots of HOA violation emails, and even records of Linda's earlier destruction of the oak tree. He had spoken with neighbors who were more than eager to sign statements, tired of living next to the blinding lights and garish spectacle. What Linda thought was just noise and defiance had, in Mark's hands, become a mountain of evidence. When the timing was right, he struck. It began with a formal complaint filed not just with the HOA, but with the city's zoning and building department. The complaint was comprehensive, meticulously detailed, and impossible to ignore. Within days, inspectors arrived at Linda's property. They measured the fence, recorded the brightness of the floodlights, and took notes on the paint's violation of neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. Linda, caught off guard, attempted her usual theatrics. She ranted at the inspectors, waving her arms and insisting she was the victim of harassment. But unlike her neighbors, the inspectors had no tolerance for her outbursts. They were professionals bound by regulations, and the evidence Mark had provided left them with little room for sympathy. The result was devastating: multiple citations, orders for immediate removal of the offending structures, and the threat of escalating fines if she failed to comply. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. For the first time, it wasn't just whispers about Linda, it was laughter. Residents who had been silent for fear of her retaliation now openly smirked as they walked by, exchanging knowing glances. Some even took photos of the inspector's trucks parked outside her house, posting them on the neighborhood's online forum with captions like, "Justice at last." But Mark wasn't finished. His true masterstroke wasn't the citations. It was the way he turned Linda S.'s own weapon against her. He applied for a permit to build a new structure in his backyard. Unlike Linda, he followed every rule to the letter, filing paperwork, seeking approval from the HOA, and presenting his plans with calm precision. The structure was a tall but elegant pergola designed for shade and outdoor gatherings. On the surface, it was an innocent addition. But its placement was deliberate, right along the property line, facing Linda's garish barricade. When construction began, neighbors gathered to watch. Piece by piece, the pergola rose, its beams carefully measured, its wood polished and painted in a tasteful finish. But the real genius came later, when Mark installed panels of reflective material along the side facing Linda's fence. By day, the panels caught the sunlight and bounced it directly onto the neon paint, intensifying the glare until her yard glowed with a blinding brightness. By night, the floodlights she had installed reflected right back at her, flooding her windows with the same unbearable glare she had inflicted on him. It was poetic justice, silent, legal, and devastating. Linda was furious. She stormed into the HOA office, demanding the pergola be torn down, claiming it was harassment. But this time her words carried no weight. Mark had followed every rule. The HOA approved the design. The city inspectors found no violations. Everything about his structure was airtight. Her complaints, once feared, were now treated as little more than noise. For the first time in years, Linda was powerless. Her fortress had become a prison, her floodlights a curse, her neon paint a source of mockery. The neighborhood, once indifferent to her antics, now openly celebrated Mark's victory. Children pointed and laughed at the glowing orange wall. Adults chuckled over how the Karen finally got what she deserved. Inside her house, however, Linda's rage grew darker. She felt cornered, humiliated, and betrayed by the very community she had once dominated. And when people like Linda feel trapped, they don't admit defeat. They lash out. Mark's masterstroke had won him the battle, but the war was far from over. Linda was planning something new, something reckless, and something that would drag the neighborhood deeper into chaos. By now, the neighborhood had transformed into something resembling a stage for an ongoing drama. Every day brought whispers of the next development in the war between Mark and Linda. Neighbors peeked through blinds, lingered on their porches, and updated each other on the latest spectacle. Where once they had rolled their eyes at Linda's antics, now they watched eagerly, as though waiting for the next act of a play. But Linda was not performing for entertainment. In her mind, she was fighting for survival. Mark's masterstroke with the pergola had humiliated her on a level she had never experienced. The reflective panels turned her own tactics against her, flooding her home with unbearable light and turning her garish fence into a neighborhood punchline. Her complaints, once feared, now drew smirks. Her authority, once unchallenged, had evaporated. Pride is a dangerous motivator, and Linda's pride was wounded beyond repair. She could not accept defeat. She could not accept that Mark had outsmarted her, and worse, that the neighborhood was laughing at her expense. And so, she broke. Her retaliation began with noise. If she could not silence Mark's pergola, she could at least disrupt his peace. She purchased outdoor speakers and blasted music at full volume, often in the early hours of the morning. It wasn't pleasant music either. It was a constant barrage of static, talk radio, and repetitive songs designed to irritate rather than entertain. She positioned the speakers along the fence line, their sound carrying directly into Mark's yard. But Mark, unshaken, recorded every incident. Soon, police were called for noise complaints. The officers who arrived were patient at first, issuing warnings. But Linda's refusal to comply escalated the situation, leading to fines that piled on top of the existing citations she still hadn't resolved. When noise failed, Linda turned to sabotage. Neighbors noticed her sneaking out at night, carrying containers toward the fence. By morning, sections of Mark's vines appeared wilted, their leaves yellowed from chemical burns. But what Linda didn't know was that Mark had anticipated this too. He had installed discreet security cameras facing the property line. Every act of sabotage, every late-night chemical dump, every petty stunt was captured in crisp detail. Within weeks, Linda's actions had been documented not just by Mark, but by other neighbors as well. The same residents who once ignored her now openly filmed her, uploading clips to the neighborhood's forum. Titles like Karen vs. Nature and Fence Watch 24/7 began appearing online. She was no longer feared. She was entertainment, a spectacle in her own downfall. But humiliation only drove her deeper into recklessness. The final straw came one windy evening when she attempted her most dangerous move yet. Armed with gasoline and matches, she tried to burn a section of Mark's vines, convinced that fire would finally rid her of the green wall that mocked her. But the plan backfired, literally. The flames spread quickly, catching on her own wooden fence before she could control them. Panicked, she scrambled to douse the fire with a garden hose, but by then, neighbors had already called the fire department. Engines roared into the neighborhood, sirens wailing, lights flashing. Firefighters contained the blaze before it could spread to the oak tree or Mark's pergola, but the damage was undeniable. Part of Linda's fence was charred and warped, blackened with soot. The air smelled of smoke for days, a reminder of her reckless attempt. The consequences came swiftly. City officials cited her for reckless endangerment. The HOA, fed up beyond repair, convened a special meeting to vote on sanctions. Neighbors lined up to voice their grievances, recounting months of harassment, noise, and destruction. By the end of the night, Linda E.'s once dominant presence was reduced to a trembling figure as the board voted unanimously to fine her heavily and begin proceedings to force compliance or face legal action. Mark, as always, sat quietly in the back of the meeting, saying little. He didn't need to. His silence carried more weight than any of Linda's rants. Everyone knew who had won this round, and everyone knew that Linda had only herself to blame. But even then, Linda's pride wouldn't let her admit defeat. She retreated into her home, curtains drawn, refusing to speak to neighbors. Packages piled on her porch, weeds overtook her lawn, and the once pristine appearance she had bragged about vanished completely. Her house, much like her reputation, was crumbling. The neighborhood had seen many petty disputes over the years, but nothing like this. What began as a single property line disagreement had escalated into sabotage, police visits, and even fire. And yet the war was not quite over. Linda still had one last card to play, a desperate final attempt to claw back control, even as everything around her fell apart. The fire should have been the end. For most people, the charred fence, the fines, the police warnings, and the HOA sanctions would have been enough to force a reckoning. It should have been the moment Linda admitted defeat, swallowed her pride, and accepted that her obsession had cost her everything. But Linda was not most people. Inside her darkened house, with curtains drawn and neighbors watching warily, she stewed in silence. Days turned into weeks, and her yard grew wild, weeds sprouting through cracks in the driveway and trash bins overflowing at the curb. Where once she had paraded as the enforcer of rules, now she lived in violation of all of them. Yet her mind wasn't on the decline of her home. It was on revenge. Her pride, bruised and battered, refused to let her accept the humiliation. In her eyes, Mark had stolen everything from her, her authority, her standing in the community, even her peace of mind. And so, she began to plot one last move. A desperate gamble. Late one night, when the neighborhood slept, Linda dragged heavy tarps, nails, and boards into her backyard. Working by the light of a single flood lamp, she began constructing an extension to her barricade, bigger, taller, and even more grotesque than before. It was less a fence and more a wall, a solid mass of mismatched boards hammered together haphazardly, rising higher than the original structure. She lined the top with jagged shards of broken glass pressed into wet cement, creating a menacing crown that gleamed under the harsh light. But the more she built, the more unhinged her creation became. The wall leaned at odd angles, unstable and poorly supported. Each nail was hammered in with frantic energy, each board added without care for balance. It was not a fence. It was a monument to obsession, a desperate attempt to prove that she still had control. By morning, the neighborhood gathered in stunned silence. Children whispered about the monster wall. Adults shook their heads, muttering about how far she had fallen. Photos spread through the community forum, some mocking, others worried. It was clear to everyone. Linda had finally snapped. Mark, as always, remained quiet. He didn't confront her, didn't shout across the property line. Instead, he simply picked up his phone and made a call. Within days, inspectors returned. This time, they did not come with clipboards alone. They came with enforcement orders. The wall, dangerous and unstable, posed a risk not only to Linda's property but to the neighborhood at large. The broken glass along the top was deemed a hazard, the height a blatant violation, and the construction itself unsafe. The verdict was swift and absolute. The wall had to come down immediately, or the city would take action to remove it at her expense. The HOA followed suit, issuing their strongest sanction yet, a formal lawsuit for repeated violations and endangerment of the community. For the first time, Linda faced not just fines, but the very real possibility of losing her home. And with that, the war ended. Not with Linda's victory, not even with Mark's pergola standing tall, but with the collapse of the woman who had started it all. Under court order, contractors arrived to dismantle the wall. Piece by piece, the boards were pried apart, the glass collected, the jagged structure reduced to rubble, the neon paint peeled, the floodlights were removed, and what remained was an empty, scarred property line, quiet and unremarkable. The neighborhood breathed a sigh of relief. For the first time in months, peace returned. The air was no longer filled with shouting, music, or the glare of floodlights. The oak tree continued to stand, scarred but alive, its branches reaching over Mark's pergola, which now stood as a quiet monument to patience and resilience. As for Linda, her downfall was complete. The HOA lawsuit dragged on, draining her finances. Her reputation was shattered beyond repair, her influence gone. Neighbors who once tiptoed around her now spoke of her only in past tense, as a cautionary tale. Eventually, her house was listed for sale, the yard overgrown and the porch stacked with neglected mail. When the moving truck arrived, no one waved goodbye. The day she left, the neighborhood gathered not to mourn but to celebrate. Children played freely in the street again. Neighbors chatted without fear of interruption, and Mark, true to form, simply sat on his porch, quiet and calm, sipping his coffee as the truck rolled away. He hadn't needed to raise his voice, to throw tantrums, or to break rules. His victory had been in patience, in precision, and in letting Linda's own obsession destroy her. The spite fence war was over. What began as a petty property line dispute had spiraled into chaos, but in the end, it was pride and stubbornness, not a neighbor, that proved to be Karen's ultimate nightmare.